All right, let's see. I think we are uh, having people come in. So we'll just give it a few seconds for everyone to log in. Let's see, let me see how many we've got so far. Okay. I think people are trickling in, but it is 6 o'clock. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started, and then people will come in as they go. And so let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Just a reminder, this is a virtual pop-up presentation on the Israel-Hamas war and its implications for global security. My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are an organization located in Louisville, Kentucky, with a mission to inform and engage people in the community on global issues, as well as offer opportunities to connect with global leaders through a variety of international exchange programs. This evening, we are fortunate to have a seasoned expert and diplomat to walk us through the developing war between Israel and Hamas, which was precipitated by the shocking assault on Israel by Hamas on October 7th. The violence that has emerged and continues is devastating. While updates on the war are constant on our airwaves, this context, history, and U.S. role in the region bears revisiting. Just as important is understanding how all of this will further shake the global security that we have all taken for granted for so many decades now. To help us think through this, the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on security in the Middle East and beyond, we are joined by Ambassador Gerald Feierstein. Ambassador Feierstein is a retired U.S. diplomat with a 41-year career and currently serves as a distinguished senior fellow on U.S. diplomacy at the Middle East Institute, and he directs its Arabian Peninsula Affairs program. He had 9 overseas postings, including 3 in Pakistan, as well as assignments in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. From 2010 to 2013, Ambassador Feierstein served as U.S. ambassador to Yemen under then-President Barack Obama. Ambassador Feierstein also played a key role in shaping State Department policies to counter violent extremism, including developing regional networks, countering terrorist financing, and promoting counter-terrorism messaging. So, Ambassador Feierstein, we truly appreciate you joining us this evening and offering us your insights into the development war between Israel and Hamas. So welcome. Please start us off with your analysis of the current state of the war and remind us how we got here, how you think this might end, and what it means for the Middle East and the global security. So over to you.
Thank you, Sho, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you this evening, and thanks to all of our friends at the Kentucky and Southern Indiana World Affairs Council. Delighted to be with you. This, of course, has a long background, a long history, and don't want to go through all of that, but just to say that the specific instances, the specific issues that are really driving this particular conflict really stretch back to 2003. When the government of Israel made a decision that they were going to withdraw from Gaza, they were going to withdraw their military presence, they were going to withdraw a number of settlements that have been established in the Gaza area, and instead what they did was that they basically put up a siege around Gaza. Certainly since 2006, they have pretty much prevented economic activity in Gaza. They've prevented people from going in and out of the enclave, and have pretty much strangled Gaza over these years. In 2006, Hamas, which is a rival of the Palestinian Authority that's led by the Palestine Liberation Organization and Fatah in particular, participated in an election which they won, and as a result, created a tension between themselves and the Palestinian Authority that led over a series of events in the 2006-2007 period to a split between the West Bank and Gaza, with Hamas controlling both on the security side as well as on the governance side the operations in Gaza. This was not opposed by the government of Israel, and in fact, on a number of occasions, the government of Israel actually encouraged Hamas to continue this because they saw it as a counterbalance to the Palestinian Authority and the pressure on them to negotiate a two-state solution. They saw Hamas and its presence as a counterbalance to the political process. And so this kind of strange relationship between Israel and Hamas has really existed for the past 16 or 17 years, with periodic explosions of violence where Hamas or another radical Palestinian group that operates in Gaza, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, would launch rockets or do other kinds of attacks against Israel, and the Israelis would respond with military force. So we've had this situation for many years now. It erupted, and as you said quite correctly, Sho, we've never seen anything like what we saw on October 7th. I think that the world was shocked by the events of October 7th, by the brutality of the Hamas assault on a number of towns on the Israeli side of the Israel-Gaza border, and of course the number of Israeli innocent casualties, about 1,400 or more, with another 200 or more being taken as hostages back into Gaza, and their fate at this moment is certainly unknown. So with the level of trauma and shock that existed in Israel as a result of that attack, we saw the government of Israel basically say that they were no longer going to tolerate Hamas's existence in the Gaza Strip, that they were going to eradicate Gaza, that they were going to launch an all-out assault against Gaza, and ordered that Gazan civilians evacuate the north, which is the more heavily populated area of the Gaza Strip, to evacuate from there to the south, keeping in mind that Gaza is one of the most densely populated environments anywhere on the face of the earth. And so the ability of people to actually move very far and take care of themselves, provide for food, shelter, etc., is very limited. So immediately after October 7th, with strong support from the United States, with strong support from at least Western Europe and much of the global community, the Israelis started to attack what they deemed as military targets inside of Gaza with the aim. And then several days ago, they expanded their approach to include both air and land, and also sea. They're also shelling Gaza from the Mediterranean. So all of these aspects have been going on. And in the meantime, they also declared immediately after the attack that they were going to cut off all entry of any kind of imported goods into Gaza, meaning no food, no medicines. They cut off fuel deliveries and everything else, creating what many people around the world are very concerned is a potential catastrophe of epic proportion among the civilians in Gaza. And so this has been going on. We understand that right now there is fairly intense fighting, particularly in Gaza City itself, with between Hamas fighters who use a series of tunnels that have been built up over many years. Some estimates of as much as 300 miles of tunnels inside the Gaza Strip, this very small area of land, against this Israeli military assault. And so the fighting is going on. The concerns are growing, not only about the extent of the operations, but also about the civilian casualties. The Gaza Health Ministry has estimated that over 8,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza since the Israeli assault began. There's also, of course, a great deal of concern about the fact that supplies are running out, and that even if it's not from the military conflict as well, the number of Palestinian civilian casualties is going to go up because of the lack of medicine, because of the lack of food, because of the lack of other basic necessities for life. As the focus has shifted from the shock that the international community felt, President Biden, expressed very clearly his own sense of shock. His travel out to Israel to share a moment of grieving with many of the Israelis. But as the assault has continued, the emphasis within large parts of the international community has really shifted from the impact of Israeli casualties on October 7th to the danger being placed on Palestinian civilians with this military operation. And so you've seen over these past number of days the kind of commentary, public statements by officials, including President Biden, on what's going on, shifting to express greater concern about the need to ensure both that Israel and its military operations do everything that it can to limit the number of civilian casualties, but also, of course, to work with Egypt as well as Israel to gain and to ensure that adequate humanitarian supplies can come into the Gaza Strip in order to provide for this population of about 2 million people that are now under threat and under duress. And so that's where we are right now in terms of this conflict. The big question, and the question that people are increasingly asking, is what comes next. The Israelis, of course, when they first declared their intention to eradicate, quote unquote, Hamas, they basically said that they were going to fundamentally level Gaza, that they were never going to permit Hamas either to have any kind of military security capacity, but also to have governing capacity. And there were even some Israelis who went so far as to suggest that they were thinking about forcing Gazans to leave the Gaza Strip and to take up some kind of residence or whatever and on the Egyptian side of the border in Sinai. The Egyptians have been extremely clear in saying that they would never permit that to happen. The United States has also said that we would be completely opposed to any suggestion that the Gaza population might be displaced, forced into some kind of refugee status. That would, of course, also be very clearly a violation of international humanitarian law and the laws of war. So increasingly, people are beginning to ask the question: what comes next? What is the extent of the Israeli objective? Have the Israelis actually defined a clear and achievable goal for themselves in this battle? With a broad segment of people who follow these issues, including myself, basically of the view that their initial idea that they were going to eradicate Hamas is actually not an achievable goal any more than it was achievable for us to eliminate Al-Qaeda after 9/11 or to eliminate ISIS in Iraq and Syria over these past number of years. These organizations can't be eradicated, and in the absence of any kind of a political horizon, the reality is that even if you could eliminate the leadership of Hamas, eliminate their military capability, some other group would come along to replace them, and the cycle of violence would continue. So there are several questions that pose themselves. One is what happens in Gaza afterwards? Who's going to govern it? Who is going to provide for security inside of Gaza? Those are questions that people are grappling with right now. Secretary of State Blinken is on his way back out to the region. There is an expectation that these questions are going to be very much on his agenda as he speaks to leaders in the region to think through what can be done once the Israeli military operations end, to begin the reconstruction in Gaza, to begin to provide once again for security, to provide essential services like health and education for young Gazans, and to do the other things. There was some suggestion that the Palestinian Authority itself might come back into Gaza. They were there until 2006. They might return to Gaza, pick up the operations. But Mohammed Shtayyeh, the prime minister for the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, has said very clearly that they would not be willing to do that in the absence of any kind of political way forward that would deal with the fundamental Israel-Palestine issue, rather than looking at Gaza as an entity that's different from the West Bank. And so this is going to be something that is going to be very much on people's minds over the coming days and weeks. One of the questions that Joe forwarded to me was, how long is the military operation going to go on? It's a good question. The Israelis initially said, well, this is going to be a long battle. It may take weeks, it may take months. I've even heard some Israeli senior officers saying this could go on for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. My own view is that that is not going to happen. That over the coming days, perhaps weeks, the pressure on the government of Israel to bring these operations to an end is going to become intense, including here in the United States, and we're seeing demonstrations. We're seeing increasing pressure on the Biden administration, particularly from progressive Democrats, to be more forceful in calling for a ceasefire, to end this conflict and allow for protecting Gazan civilians. The president initially rejected that, but I saw that today he's begun to talk about a pause. So I think, again, the emphasis is going to shift over the coming days as the number of casualties on the Palestinian side rises. and there's going to be more and more pressure put on Israel to end this battle. The other question, of course, the critical question, and I think a question that is keeping the Biden administration senior officials up at night, is really what is the threat for expanding this conflict. We've seen growing tension between Israel and Hezbollah on the northern border, between Israel and Lebanon. We've seen the Houthis in Yemen launching some drone and missile attacks that were aimed at Israel. None of them has actually succeeded in reaching Israel. But as the conflict goes on, the pressure on pro-Iranian militias, particularly Hezbollah in the north, but there are a number of pro-Iranian militias operating in Syria, operating in Iraq, that could open a northern front against Israel, growing pressure perhaps on the Houthis to do more, and even on Iran itself to do more. That's going to increase the threat of a broader conflict that might, in fact, draw in the U.S. You've seen over these last couple of weeks, the U.S. has deployed 2 carrier battle groups into the Eastern Mediterranean. They've also sent over 1,000, I think we're up to about 1,200 additional ground forces to the region in order to both protect U.S. military personnel in the region, as well as to be prepared for any potential eventuality of an expanded war. The Jordanians have asked for additional military support from the U.S. Because they're concerned about the potential for an expanding conflict. So as this conflict drags on, and as the situation in Gaza becomes more dire, the threat of an expanded conflict is going to become more of a real threat, and something that the U.S. is doing everything that it can to deter and ensure that neither the Iranians nor their affiliates believe that they can succeed in threatening Israeli security on a new front. So, and then the last thing that I'll say is, in terms of a long-term strategy, and in reality, we've been in this cycle of violence between Israel and the Palestinians really for the entire history of Israel. For about 75 years, we have seen these repeated episodes of violence between Israel and the Palestinians, 2 intifadas, other periods of terrorism, other kind of military operations in Palestinian territories. We've seen an expansion of the settlements particularly in the West Bank, and with increasing threats to Palestinian populations in the West Bank from extremist elements within the Israeli political framework. And so I think that to a certain extent, people are once again looking and saying that after a 25-year hiatus, the time has come where the international community really needs to focus its attention on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we have to be clear that we can't look at Gaza as separate from the Palestinian issue. Gaza is part of a single Palestinian entity, and a resolution for Gaza requires that there be a political process that resolves all of the issues between Israel and Palestine. It's unlikely that either on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side that the leadership is prepared to undertake that right now. And on the Palestinian side, you have a very aged and not fully trusted leadership with Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, as the president of the Palestinian Authority. On the Israeli side, there's very clearly going to be period of accountability, of an exploration of how the October 7th event came to pass. And I think that a vast number of Israelis have been very clear in saying that Bibi Netanyahu is no longer viable, valid as legitimate as the Prime Minister of Israel. They want new leadership, and we may be in for a period of time where Israelis perhaps have to return to the polls again to elect a new government, and that's going to take time. But I think it's important at this juncture, and what I've written in my own kind of writings about this issue is that really the Biden administration, shouldn't wait for the shooting to stop before they begin to put on the table ideas for how we can go forward. Perhaps an international conference like we had after the first Gulf War, the Madrid conference, that brought together many of the actors to try to advance a political process with limited success, but to bring in the Europeans, the United Nations, and critically, I think a number of the Arab states, particularly those states that have signed agreements, normalization agreements with Israel, the Emiratis, Bahrain, Morocco, all can play important roles in trying to advance dialogue, negotiation, and hopefully a resolution of the conflict. And that the administration, but the administration needs to lead this process, and I would hope that they would do that sooner rather than later. So I have talked for about 25 minutes, and let me stop here and respond to your questions.
Wonderful. That was an amazing overview. You covered so many things, and as you were talking, I was closing out some of the questions that we had prior to that. So you've answered quite a few. So thank you for that. And I do want to let the audience know that we have quite a number of questions. They are still coming, and you're welcome to put this in. But I want to get started just to kind of try to put them into different buckets. So maybe we might start with a couple of questions more clarifying. One is historical, asking the question of, why did Israel put up a functional border around Gaza in 2006 and 2007?
Well, I think that was it was during the prime ministership of Ariel Sharon, and I think that it was in part in response to the fact that Hamas had taken control of the situation in Gaza, that Hamas, of course, as part of its charter, calls for the destruction of Israel, still does, unlike the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which took that language out of its charter. Hamas still does. And so, having made the decision to remove an Israeli presence, and in order to provide security for Israel, the decision was made that they would more or less create this wall between Gaza and Israel. No goods can go into Gaza without being inspected by the Israelis, and the number of Gazans who can come out from Gaza into Israel is severely restricted. They have some workers that they allow out, but other than that, really not very much movement is permitted. And so Gaza has often been referred to by outside observers as an open air prison.
Yes, and to that point, one of the questions, do you know about how many Gazans were working in Israel prior to this attack in October?
I
Approximate?
don't. It
Okay.
was not a big number.
Yeah.
It might have been hundreds. It could have been low thousands, but not more than that.
Okay. Well, there's a couple questions regarding Hamas. Really, one is Do you know if there's been any statements, formal statements made by Hamas regarding their initial attack on Israel? What might have precipitated it? What was behind it? And then a couple questions in addition around that. In terms of the financing of Hamas, do they have any investments around MENA countries in the Middle East and North Africa countries, and what their overall financing global portfolio might look like?
Both good questions. And of course, um, there is the political leadership of Hamas, which is primarily not in Gaza. They are scattered throughout the region. Some are in Qatar, some are in Turkey, some are in Egypt. And so they have made various kinds of statements. Then there's the military leadership, which is in Gaza, which, of course, is the part of Hamas that organized the attack and really took responsibility for it. And so you've gotten different kinds of explanations. I think that to a certain extent, what's clear is that Hamas saw the movement, particularly in the broader Arab world, towards normalization with Israel. The efforts that the Biden administration was making with some positive movement to promote normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That to a certain extent Hamas saw that time was running out, and that there was a desire on their part really to reestablish the centrality of the Palestinian issue in terms of promoting regional security and stability, and that might have been a major motivation for them to do that. Clearly they might very well have taken some comfort from the internal disarray inside of Israel, the deep political divisions that have emerged since this latest Netanyahu government came into office last December, with the efforts on the part of the government to promote these judicial reforms, and a huge pushback on the part of millions of Israelis opposing that. And so you had, for example, a number of Israeli reservists saying that they would not go to their positions in the case of conflict because of their unhappiness with the direction of democracy inside of Israel, and that might have given Hamas some incentive to strike now. And there's probably also a domestic, Palestinian issue, which is again this friction between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, in addition to its strong position in Gaza, has been gaining strength in the West Bank, and they might have seen that a spectacular attack like this would, in fact, establish them as the main voice, if you will, of the Palestinians, and that it would be, they would be able then to basically undermine and end the Palestinian Authority. So all of those issues might have been factors into what Hamas was thinking. In terms of the money, it's a good question, and we've seen, of course, the Israelis being much more interested in that now. The U.S. Treasury is also pursuing its inquiries into where Hamas funding is coming from. I understand from sources of the region that Hamas gets about $100 million a year in support from Iran. But presumably they have other money coming in from other sources, whether they're sympathizers elsewhere in the Middle East. But I wouldn't necessarily just limit their potential assets to what could be in the Middle East. It could be anywhere. It could be here in the U.S. It could be in Europe. Latin America. So, and I've seen estimates that Hamas had up to $1 billion in assets scattered around the world. I don't know whether that's a true figure or not, but I've seen that.
Great, thank you. Well, what something that you already alluded to earlier on, when we were talking about what the current situation. So there's a lot of concern for that humanitarian devastation coming out of Gaza, and quite honestly, increasing questions about Israel's attacks. So we've had a couple of questions related to this. One audience asked, "Is Israel committing war crimes?" How much, can the US influence Israel to stop killing long enough for people in Gaza to get out? Is Hamas also in South Gaza as well?
Right. So, the question, of course, of whether Israel has violated the laws of war in its operations, I think is certainly being hotly debated all around the world right now. I think it's very difficult to make that assessment in the middle of the conflict. I suspect that people will be looking at it afterwards to have a better understanding of what exactly the Israeli operations were, whether they were hitting legitimate military targets or whether they were excessive. And this is always it's always something that is a question. It was a question about U.S. operations in Afghanistan. It was a question about Saudi operations in Yemen. I mean, there's always this debate, and the answer is never entirely clear. It is clear that the number of Palestinian casualties of children, thousands of Palestinian children have been killed. So whether or not it's a war crime, it certainly is a humanitarian disaster. And I think that that as we've gone along, the question of letting Gazans get out is also a fraught conversation, because there are certainly people in Israel who believe that the answer for this situation is to push Gazans into Sinai, into Egypt. But the Egyptians, keeping in mind that about half of the population of Gaza are Palestinians who fled the fighting in either 1948 when Israel was created, or 1947, or 1967 during the 6-Day War, and so these are people who've already been displaced from their homes in what's now Israel, and they don't, they would not willingly go again, leave their homes in Gaza. And the Egyptians have been very clear, because the Egyptians are concerned that there may be some Israelis who see that this is a long term, that it's not a question of providing a temporary refuge for people, that they see this as a solution, that they would just like to push the population of Gaza out of Gaza entirely, permanently, and therefore, solve their security problem that way. That is completely, and the Egyptians have been very clear, and we've been very clear in saying that that is obviously an unacceptable idea. So the border crossing between Egypt and Gaza has been opened a little bit today. There are a number of Gazans who hold foreign passports, including U.S. passports. I think the number I've seen is about 400 or 500 Palestinian Americans who are trapped in Gaza. Many of them have been able to leave. There have also been a number of wounded Gazan civilians who've been allowed to cross over into Egypt to get medical care. But the Egyptians aren't going to allow any major movement of Gazans into Egypt at all. That's a non-starter. In terms of whether Hamas is operating in the south, almost certainly they are. They are, part of the Palestinian fabric, and so where there are Palestinians, probably Hamas has some kind of a presence.
Yeah, and a number of questions regarding the support for Hamas within the Palestinian communities in among the Palestinian people. We had questions that there had been any elections since 2006, and that they want to know what do people in this in the region feel about the Israel Palestine conflict. Do they feel that this is a fight that they would be willing to get involved in? Your thoughts on just the sentiment in the Middle East as well as the Palestinians.
Yeah, a couple of things. There has not been an election since 2006, and at that time, Hamas won a victory, a parliamentary victory. But of course, the Palestinian Authority continued to maintain the executive authority until Hamas pushed them out of Gaza entirely and took over complete control. There's not a real clear answer about how strong the support for Hamas is among Palestinians. I've seen polls that suggested that it's only about 30% of Palestinians who are supporters of Hamas, but nobody really knows right now. And it's important to know that also, to distinguish between Palestinians and Hamas. There is very little sympathy for Hamas anywhere in the Arab world for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is because of Hamas's close association with Iran, which, certainly in the Gulf is seen as the major threat to their security and stability. Also because Hamas is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, with political Islam, which is certainly seen as a threat in Egypt, as well as in the Gulf states. So there's not a lot of sympathy for Hamas. There is a lot of sympathy, particularly among Arab publics, for the Palestinians. And what we've seen is, we saw, beginning with the Trump administration, carried over now into the Biden administration, this idea that there could be an outside-in approach to legitimizing Israel's presence in the region. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, signed a normalization agreement. Bahrain, Morocco, even Sudan, under former leadership, signed an agreement. The Saudis were deep in negotiating their own agreement with Israel. A lot of reasons why that would be. Particularly the Gulf states, saw a closer relationship with Israel as being an important counterbalance to what they saw as an Iranian threat. There's been a kind of under the table cooperation between Israel and the Gulf Arab states for a number of years now. So these Abraham Accords agreements only formalized what already existed in terms of cooperation. But there was also the thought, and it was a thought that was pressed by Bibi Netanyahu and his government, but also, of course, echoed by the Trump administration, that Arabs in general no longer were concerned about the Palestinian issue. They were tired of the Palestinians. They didn't want to have to deal with it. They saw a benefit to dealing with Israel. I think that what we've seen, particularly over the last year and even long before October 7th, is that there's been a resurgence of popular support and sympathy for the Palestinians. a lot of Arabs around the world and Muslims even more broadly have seen some of the things that have been going on, particularly since this far-right government in Jerusalem took office last December, that have angered them, frustrated them. There's been a big increase in violence directed at Palestinians in the West Bank. Several hundred Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank this year, often through settler violence, right-wing extremist settlers who are attacking Palestinian villages, farms, elsewhere. They are very concerned about what's happening in East Jerusalem, particularly on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, as you know, is the third holiest site in Islam, where again, extremist Jews have violated the status quo, which said that while Jews were permitted to visit the Temple Mount, which is also, of course, holy for Jews, they would not be permitted to pray there, and even to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is a separate is a structure within the Temple Mount, is something that is a red line for many Muslims around the world. We've seen that, and so the frustration with what's going on in the region has been growing for a year, and that has brought about a much greater sympathy for the Palestinians and a commitment to supporting an Israeli-Palestinian settlement. Not to fight. It's not a question of people going to the West Bank to fight, but what we're talking about is really demanding that their government play a more active role in pressing for a political resolution of the conflict.
Thank you for that, and for really distinguishing the Hamas from Palestinians. And I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes we don't really we tend to put them together, but they are very different. There's a number of questions about the hostages, which is really where, kind of heart of a lot of this right now. And so questions, have you heard anything else about the hostage negotiations? Is there a better strategy if the hostages are going to be released? What might that look like? So there's a lot of concern about that, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, and we know that Qatar and Egypt, both of which have longstanding channels of communication to Hamas, have been very active in trying to broker some kind of an agreement between Israel and Hamas that would lead to the release of the hostages. The Qataris have had limited success. I think they got 4 of the hostages out. They also probably played a role in coordinating on opening that crossing from Egypt into Gaza at Rafah to allow at least those Palestinians who have foreign passports to get out. So they're working on this. I guess the question is really, what is Hamas demanding in return for releasing the hostages? They had said initially that they wanted a release of Palestinian political prisoners in Israel. There are probably about 6,000 Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons for a variety of offenses that they were demanding that they be released. And so, whether there is a deal there to be had is a little bit unclear at this juncture. But certainly, Secretary Blinken has been on the phone with his Qatari counterparts and with his Egyptian counterparts, trying to coordinate on what the negotiating strategy might be. And again, as we know, among the hostages, there are a number of Americans, Israeli Americans who are being held. So that is, of course, of great interest directly for the Biden administration.
And we're hearing updates every day from our news, various news outlets that we all kind of subscribe to. I'd like to really kind of now take our conversation a little bit, you know, bigger outside a little bit, and talk about what we kind of started with the global security implications. And a lot of this, you know, some things having to do with some of the work you've done already. So, you know, you've done a lot on countering violent extremism, which is, you know, something that we had really talked a lot about in previous years. In recent years, we don't hear too much about anymore, right? And I just want to get your thoughts on what do you think the effect of this war is going to be on violent extremist activities around the world and its messaging to possible extremist supporters?
Well, it's an interesting question, and one of the things, when I was working on counterterrorism, which is 2006, 2008, and then I was in Pakistan for a period after that, and then in Yemen, where our fight against Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was kind of a major pillar of what our policy was. We never really looked at Hamas particularly in that context, primarily because Hamas never really threatened the United States. It was not, it was not interested in attacking the U.S. or doing anything else. Its focus was really on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and trying to advance. And of course, the Israelis themselves thought that they could manage the relationship through what they called a hudna, which is a long-term kind of ceasefire. They thought that they could get that. So we didn't really think about Hamas in that light. I think in terms of global terrorism, if you're thinking of Al Qaeda or the Islamic State in Syria, they really wouldn't look at Hamas as an organization that is interesting for them. Hamas never really had anything to do with them. They never, cooperated. Hamas is more a part of what's called the axis of resistance. That is the pro-Iranian militia groups, again, primarily Hezbollah, which has very significant military capabilities, the Houthis in Yemen, a number of pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria. They, of course, would see Hamas as a partner with them in this larger Iranian infrastructure. And we've seen, of course, that there have been a number of incidents of attacks across the border from these groups into Israel, but also a number of attacks against U.S. military personnel in the region. The last I saw, there have been about 24 attacks launched by these groups against U.S. facilities in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And that, I think, would be the major concern, is whether this would in some way bring more of that to the fore, keeping in mind that Hezbollah has global reach. And in fact, if you remember, many years ago, there was a terrible attack in Argentina targeting a Jewish community center with I've forgotten how many, but a significant number of casualties that we believe and the Israelis believe was a Hezbollah operation. So they do have the capacity, if they decide to do it, to actually undertake terror attacks pretty much anywhere in the world. They have a lot of presence in Africa. They have a lot of presence in Latin America, in Europe, and probably even here in the U.S.
And to kind of go even further out, just comment, if you will, on how this war is perhaps further revealing the emerging international split around the different types of, whether it's ideologies or the different international security regime that we're entering into, right? That became much more evident with the Russian war in Ukraine. How, what is the international community? What is that split? Are there very defined camps that we can see, and are they similar to the ones that we see in with Russia and Ukraine?
Um, they 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 are, and one of the problems that the Biden administration is grappling with is that many people in the Arab world, but even beyond that, in what's called the global South, if you will, look at the U.S. response to the attack, the October 7th attack, and the aftermath, the Israeli military operations, and the strong support that the U.S. has expressed for Israel's right to defend itself. And they see that, whereas we have been extremely strong and vocal in talking about how the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the rules-based international order, or of humanitarian laws, that we don't hold the Israelis to the same standard that we hold the Russians, that we have accepted Israel's military response as legitimate, whereas we have condemned the Russians. Now, of course, there's a fundamental difference in that Ukraine never attacked Russia, that the Russians are aggressors in Ukraine, whereas the events of these last several weeks in the Middle East were precipitated by a Hamas attack against Israel. So there's a fundamental, a practical difference there. But nevertheless, people look at these issues side by side, and they say, why is it that you care more about Ukrainians than you care about Palestinians? And why are you so focused? And so that has brought to the fore, some of the contradictions and some of the criticism of U.S. Policy on the war in Ukraine, that we're selective in what we choose to be offended by. In terms of the lineup, of course, the major support for Hamas are the Iranians and their allies around the world. In terms of great power competition, it cuts a little bit both ways. The Russians, of course, have a very close relationship with Iran. The Russians have blocked in the Security Council criticisms of Iran's role in supporting Hamas, and they're not going to permit any kind of international condemnation of Iran's role. And yet they also maintain an important relationship with Israel. They have more or less had a modus vivendi in Syria, where the Israelis have operated to try to prevent the buildup of forces against them by attacking locations inside of Syria, and the Russians who are operating there have allowed that to happen. So they coordinate with one another to make sure that they don't come into conflict with each other. The Russians also, there's a huge number of Russian Jews in Israel who maintain contacts back in Russia, and so so the Russians are a little bit divided about how they go. They'll support Iran, but they won't necessarily support Hamas. The Chinese also in a little bit of a complicated situation. Close partners with Iran. Certainly would be sympathetic to the Palestinians, longstanding issues, but they also have important trade and investment relations with Israel. There's a close, economic partnership between Israel and China. And so the Chinese also are going to want to balance between these various different issues within their own policy. There's not, on a global context, I think that there's not really a huge difference among the great powers, but between the global South and the West, increasingly the unwillingness of Western governments, the U.S., U.K., European Union, to criticize Israeli operations in Gaza is creating tensions and frustrations towards the U.S.
Yeah, so there's still quite a lot to be we still have quite a bit to see in the days ahead, because it sounds like many of these powers have balanced interests in some ways in all of these, so it kind of prevents from real divides at this point. I'd just like to end. We had the last couple of minutes with just your experience. You're a minister level diplomat with your many years of service. And how effective do you think, do you see diplomacy? How effective have diplomacy been in this conflict? And what do you think there are its limits? Currently, we don't have a U.S. ambassador, and I guess from the U.S.
Jack Lew was just confirmed the other
Just
day.
confirmed.
Yeah,
That's right.
Confirmed the other day. So he should probably be out, I would say, probably in the next week or so.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and what are the limits of diplomacy? Is diplomacy going to be, how effective? So far, we've seen it in action, but we've been hearing a lot about the military side of it, right? We haven't heard about much of that from the U.S. As of right now. So, yeah, your thoughts on that based on your experience, and then finally, just what would be the ideal outcome of this war, if you have thoughts on that?
Well, on the diplomacy, and it's kind of it's unfortunate, because I would say that the U.S. in some ways kind of dropped the ball. The last time that we really saw a president of the United States put his own personal effort into promoting a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the Clinton administration. As you know, I mean, Bill Clinton was very much involved. The U.S. in his administration helped broker what became the Oslo II agreement in 1994, that really established a roadmap for resolving the conflict. The U.S. continued to engage. The Oslo II agreement laid out a 5-year timeline for resolving all of what were called the final status issues between Israel and the Palestinians. The administration was deeply engaged over that period in trying to help the two sides reach agreement on some of these fundamental issues: refugees, Jerusalem, the borders, excuse me, some other things. That culminated. There was an agreement in 1998 at Wye River, which is a conference center in Maryland, that further defined what the objectives were, what the basic framework of an agreement would look like. And then in 2000, President Clinton invited Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, and Yasser Arafat to come to Camp David, hopefully to reach an agreement. They negotiated for 2 weeks, but they were not successful. And after that, there were a series of events that culminated in the beginning of a second intifada, a second kind of violence, Israeli-Palestinian violence, and then Ariel Sharon, who was not interested, frankly, in making peace with the Palestinians, came into office. And at that point, I would have to say that from 2000 until today, we haven't really seen a strong U.S. Effort to try to mediate. I think that that the U.S. Kind of line was that we can't want peace more than the parties. So we threw our hands up, to be honest, and didn't do an awful lot. John Kerry, when he was a Secretary of State, said that his reason for taking the position was that he wanted to be the person who was going to broker the Israeli-Palestinian agreement. He put in a lot of effort, a lot of time in trying to do that. To be honest, he didn't have a lot of support from Barack Obama, who like his predecessor, didn't really see that there was much prospect of this being successful. And then I think, unfortunately, Donald Trump took us in the wrong direction, made resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even worse, even harder. And Joe Biden, until now, has really, said that his objective is to move away from a focus on the Middle East towards the Indo-Pacific, where he believes that the threat to U.S. security and U.S. interests is greatest. So now we've come full circle, and I think that there is a sense, once again, that we've left the Israeli-Palestinian issue to fester really for nearly 25 years. And what not to legitimize or apologize for the Hamas attack, but this is the result that you get from not giving any people any kind of hope or optimism for their future over a quarter of a century. And so I think that hopefully the world is coming back to a recognition that there needs to be a return to the political process. We need to give Israelis and Palestinians both a reason to be optimistic that they can resolve their differences and that they can live side by side. It's revived what was the two-state solution, which was the fundamental element of the Oslo agreement, was that you were going to have a Palestinian state living side by side with an Israeli state, and that they were going to live at peace. A lot of people have said over these last few years that two-state is dead. We've seen growth of settlements, the impossibility of identifying, a Palestinian, entity within secure borders. But I think two-state is coming back because there really isn't any alternative. And I do hope, and again, I hope that the president uses this moment to try to bring the international community together, to bring in the UN, the Europeans, the Arabs, to support a new emphasis on finding solutions to these longstanding issues. It will take time. It's not going to happen this year. It's probably not going to happen next year. But to at least begin the process so that people will see that it's moving in the right direction and that they should be optimistic. And that's what I hope will happen.
Well, it's unfortunate that we have to talk about this within this context, and but we thank you so much, Ambassador Feierstein, for your sweeping and really illuminating analysis this evening, and really sharing your insights and expertise with us. I think we had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we can't possibly get to all of them within this time that we have, but thank you for that. And I just also want to thank everybody who's joined us tonight for your questions. There's updates out of the region every day. We encourage everyone to visit the reliable sources to really help you navigate those thoughts and opinions and whatever future actions you might want to take. And we just want to say that these events and topics can be really mentally exhausting and threaten our sense of security, right? And we just want to remind everyone to remember that this conflict is personal to many of our community members and neighbors, and that the current news ecosystem may be a bit overwhelming. So just make sure to log off when you need, take care of yourself, and seek peace whenever you can. So thank you all very much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Ambassador Feierstein.
Thank you,
Take
Shao. It was
care.
a pleasure.
Good night.
Good night.